Good morning. Welcome, welcome. We are just getting started. We've got almost 200 people registered for this session today. So we're gonna give folks a few minutes to arrive and settle in. So we're just kind of arriving right now and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thanks for being with us. Welcome, welcome. Good morning. I am Shadi Salehi. I'm with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. Really happy to see you all this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're logging in from today. We're still just giving ourselves a few more minutes to allow for folks to arrive, get their audio figured out, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. If you are just joining us, please do feel free to have your cameras on. I love seeing all these faces. I see a few familiar faces. Great to see you. But no pressure. You don't have to have your camera on if you're not feeling camera ready today. But please do mute yourselves. And we'll be using the chat box for questions and comments throughout the session today. And we welcome you to offer any questions, any insights, any comments that are coming up for you during the discussion. We want this to be as interactive as can be in this format. So we've got about 78 people on so far. Again, we've got almost 200 people registered. So we'll give a few more minutes for folks to get settled in and then we'll officially start. But one thing I do want to say, since we have a large group of people joining from California and we are in the middle of a heat wave and we have all gotten warnings about rolling blackouts. So if one of our speakers gets cut off due to a blackout, please bear with us and we'll do our best to log back on. And same for you. If you get bumped out, feel free to log back in. You know, it's our reality, so here it is. Okay, it looks like we've got a good group. So I'm gonna go ahead and get us all started. Welcome, I am Shadi Salehi. I am the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I'm really thrilled to be here partnering with Philanthropy California on this series of webinars. We are on number 6 of 7 webinars, really digging deep into the concepts of trust-based philanthropy. Before we get started, just a little bit of quick Zoom housekeeping. If you're just joining us, please do manage your own audio. Please stay muted if you are not speaking. Of course, there's gallery view and you can take a look at all of our beautiful people today. But you can also put it on speaker view if you kind of lose sight of who's speaking. And yes, we will have questions in the chat box. So throughout today, please do, or throughout the session, please feel free to pose your questions in the chat box. I love seeing everyone kind of commenting on where they're calling in from today. It looks like we've got a good turnout from across the country. And that is our kind of general housekeeping. But before we get started, we always like to kind of start these sessions with a bit of a breathing exercise. These are, I mean, I don't even need to say it, but these are unusual times and things are crazy, things are stressful. I know school's starting this week for many people. So you've got kids back in school virtually or maybe back in school in person. It's a lot to juggle, a lot to manage, and we're also in the middle of a lot of really intense work to manage what's going on in the world. So please join me for a moment. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. Try to get your feet flat on the ground, or even if you want to sit on the ground, if that feels more comfortable, and just kind of shake out your body a little bit, relax your shoulders, close your eyes. And together, let's take one deep breath in on the count of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it at the top. And then exhale on the count of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's do that again. Inhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it at the top. Exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One more time. Inhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it. And then exhale and let it all go. Thank you. Oh, it's always so nice to just kind of get back into our bodies for a minute before we get into our heads. So I'm going to just share my screen real quick so we can do a little rundown of today. Bear with me. This is still always a little clunky, even though I've done this a few times. Play from current slide. Alrighty, so thank you for joining us. This is a collaboration of Philanthropy California, which is the Alliance of Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and San Diego Grantmakers. And we've teamed up with Philanthropy California as the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project to put on a series of webinars that really dig into the concepts of trust-based philanthropy. The Trust-Based Philanthropy Project was founded in January as a peer-to-peer learning and advocacy initiative to make trust-based practices the norm in our sector. So this is one part of our offering to the sector. We do webinars, we do a lot of peer networking things. So this is part of that programming. I encourage you to check out the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project website for more events and resources that we offer to the field. So this has been our schedule. We kicked off in March and doing a series on each of the trust-based principles that you see listed here every month. This is our 6th session, offering support beyond the check. And our final session will be next month on making the case for trust-based philanthropy. That will be kind of our capstone of this series. If you've missed any of these past webinars, we do have recordings available. Either by contacting Northern California Grantmakers. We also have the recordings on the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. We've set up these sessions so that they can kind of stand on their own, but they also do build upon each other. So if you're just joining us for the first time, it's all good. We'll do a little refresh on the trust-based principles, and then we'll kind of dig into the conversation. These are our fabulous speakers for today. You may have seen some of them on our past sessions, but we'll have Carrie Avery, who's the president of the Durfee Foundation based in Los Angeles. Leslie Ito, who's executive director of the Armory Center for the Arts in Los Angeles. John Esterle, the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute. And Vera De Vera, the director of leadership for movements at Weingart Foundation. We'll hear from these folks today. We'll hear stories about how they've experienced and embodied trust-based practices in their work. And they're really kind of the stars of today. So I'll be done talking soon so we can hear from our speakers. But just a quick refresh to get us started. Trust-based philanthropy at its core is really acknowledging the prevalence of power imbalance in our sector between foundations and nonprofits. And as a whole, we really look at this work as an ecosystem approach. So beyond the principles that are just one part of this practice about how to practically embody trust-based philanthropy, there's this bigger understanding of relationships as the crux of how we do this work, and the value and the importance of building trust-based relationships in order to foster more trust-based culture within organizations and foster more trust-based collaborations toward this kind of greater vision of a healthier, connected ecosystem and society. So that's kind of the big vision. We also talk about trust-based philanthropy really as a values-based approach. So again, even when we're talking about nuts and bolts of the practices and the principles, always above all of that and undergirding all of that are these core values of leading with trust rather than suspicion, centering relationships in our work, collaborating with humility and curiosity, redistributing power and acknowledging those power imbalances and being very intentional about that. And then ultimately working for systemic equity, because if we can't really talk about power without talking about some of these more systemic inequities and systemic injustices in our work, and the role of philanthropy in undoing and reversing some of that. So these are kind of our core values that we lead with. And really, you know, just a reminder that we're in this time of a convergence of multiple crises, which is only underscoring the power imbalances that have been permeating our society for a long, long time. And so, of course, philanthropy has a role to play in that, and trust-based philanthropy is one offering of how to think and approach the work differently. So today, it's one of the principles that we're exploring is support beyond the check. This, in our kind of listing of principles, is the 6th of the 6 principles, but it's such an important contribution in this work. The idea behind support beyond the check is that funders have a lot to offer that goes well beyond dollars. Funders have connections, relationships, access, convening power, knowledge, can provide moral support. And in fact, sometimes these assets, these contributions can be even more valuable than dollars alone because it helps foster deeper trust over time. So we're going to be hearing examples of what does this look like? What do we mean by offering support beyond the check? And how can we embody this in ways that are truly inclusive, that can be truly supportive of nonprofit partners? So I'm going to stop my screen now so we can actually take a look at our speakers. You know, support beyond the check has always been a really important way for funders to offer a supportive boost to nonprofit partners. But we have to acknowledge that right now, nonprofits are actually under even more stress than ever before. I mean, first we have to acknowledge that running a nonprofit in and of itself is a tremendously stressful 24/7 job. But in this moment, there's extra strain and extra pressure on nonprofit leaders. So in fact, this is a time when offering support beyond the check might even be even more needed than before. So I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Leslie Ito, who's the executive director of the Armory Center for the Arts. And Leslie, can you please offer us a little bit of perspective as a nonprofit leader, as a leader of an arts organization? We know that the arts have been kind of under some extra challenges in these times because people can't convene. And just would love to hear from you, you know, from your standpoint, why is support beyond the check such an important offering? And what has been useful to you as a nonprofit leader?
Thank you, Shadi, for including me in this conversation. I think you really hit on it when you talked about the moral support piece. And, you know, I think maybe for us in California, we have a stereotype of being a little more touchy-feely than the rest of the country. But, you know, and I've been thinking about why the moral support and going beyond the transactional relationship is so important, particularly in a time like this. And, you know, I think the ear and the shoulder of our funding partners is really important, particularly for executive directors. It's, you know, we've always known that it's very isolating work, but we're in a position of making some really tough decisions under very uncertain times. And the increased need from the field. I've been thinking about all of, you know, the things that I'm personally faced with, battling systemic racism, really tough financial decisions, navigating layoffs and what that means both for the people that I've laid off and also for the people that remain, the survivor, how to navigate survivor's guilt for the rest of the staff, thinking about the public health issues, both to protect staff, but also to prepare to open back up to the public at some point, the political climate, and then all of the personal things. Now that we're working from home, these boundaries have been melting away, caring for loved ones. And so all of these things that sort of color the context of our work in the present day is really, it's emotional work. I think if we're doing it right, it takes a personal toll on particularly executive directors. So, I think that for me, early on in the pandemic, I reached out to funders, the ones that I've had the closest relationships with, and really it was a way for me to, I felt a responsibility to share what I was experiencing in the field, knowing that what I was experiencing was not unique to me. And, I think we talk about the power dynamics between grantees and funders. And I think, I encourage my colleagues as grant seekers to really reach out to those that they have a long time relationship with, to share what's going on, because I think that this is how we kind of level the playing field. It's okay. These should be human to human, people to people kinds of conversations. And, and just as the same, we should have the courage to reach out. I encourage funders, and being a former funder myself, being available, being open and honest, and have authentic conversations. I think that coaching is going to be really key right now. I think it's a really important way. I've been thinking about the beyond the check. Prior to March, I would have answered this question very differently. I think technical assistance is always super helpful, but I think we're really coming down to building relationships and providing emotional support for our leaders in the field, so that they can continue to stay whole, so that we can do our jobs in leading the sector. So I'll leave it at that and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. We'll hear more from Leslie too about some of those specifics. And thank you for really sharing some tips and advice on what can we do in this current moment. I'm going to turn us over to John Esterle, who is the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute. And for those of you who may be aware, the Whitman Institute was one of the kind of original conceptualizers and namers of trust-based philanthropy. And I should mention, before we go into all that, we recognize that a lot of these principles of trust-based philanthropy are not new. We recognize that a lot of these practices exist in the way you practice and the way you embody trust and relationships in your work. We have collectively named the 6 practices and the values as trust-based philanthropy as a kind of shorthand for us to acknowledge the intersection of all these different elements that are intentional ways of breaking down power imbalance and really ultimately supporting nonprofits and doing their best work. So I wanted to acknowledge that. But John, as one of the original architects of trust-based philanthropy, why is it that you and your co-executive director, Pia Infante, really felt the need to call out support beyond the check as a core practice? What informed that?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shadi, and thanks to you and Kate and Philanthropy California for hosting today, and for everybody for participating. I think what really informed it at root was the basic premise that I think underlines all these principles for us, was the sense of partnering in a spirit of service. And so it sprang from, on our end, an offer that came along with our unrestricted support is we want to support you, and we are in alignment with you. And if there are any other ways we can be supportive, in addition to financially, let us know. And so because we value dialogue and relationship building at the Institute, it was always, well, how do we invite that with the people we are supporting and partnering with? So it was an invitation to hear from them of how we could be supportive, and it wasn't a requirement. And so what we found over the years was some of the importance of things that Leslie was just referencing. The importance of just being a sounding board sometimes and an empathic listener. EDs, it can be a lonely position sometimes. And so we found over time that there was value in that. What I've been struck by over the years, when you have kind of an open invitation to say, let us know how we can be helpful, there's a whole spectrum of things you can do, from the more informal to more formal things. Now, we never went in the more formal direction, but informally, I would say always helpful to open doors to other funders. So over the years, we've done like funder lunches, and they were structured also as learning dialogic things. But so opening doors and being an advocate for the work, we found was really appreciated. And in reaching out to other funders, sometimes I found, well, if I can be the one reaching out and doing the inviting, then sometimes let me be the one hearing the no. And I'll take that on, because they hear that enough. So it was like being an intermediary sometimes was helpful there. I think what we found over the years, being also, as I said, kind of an informal coach and cheerleader. We have sometimes over the years been invited in to, give more strategic support and thinking and feedback. We have a good meeting space in our office. It's kind of a living room kind of space. So over the years, people would say, can we use the space for like a off-site day for our own team or our own retreats? I think connecting and convening we found very helpful and appreciated, and not just connecting with other funders, but connecting with peers, and sometimes connecting with folks working with aligned values, but maybe in different contexts or issues. And so we started seeing this kind of cross-fertilization across areas of work that people found beneficial because they weren't getting them in other spaces. And so one formal thing we did do over the years was we would periodically have these 2.5-day retreats where we would bring our grantee partners together with our board. They started smaller and then over time became bigger events based on what we heard back from our grantee partners. And also because we did include people we formally supported financially, but didn't anymore, but still felt connected with. So I think I just want to raise up one of the things with support beyond the check is that sometimes that support can extend beyond the life of your grant. And that is actually really appreciated as well, that the relationship doesn't go away because the money has gone away. And so, especially now as we're looking at spending out ourselves, that is coming up again. And then, for me, it was support beyond the check really does link to these other practices of trust-based philanthropy. When you're giving unrestricted funding, when you're streamlining reporting and proposal, that actually frees you up the time to take on these different roles and be responsive in that way. When you provide support over time, what I've also noticed is that maybe one year you're not providing that much support beyond the check. You maybe see somebody a couple times a year, have a conversation. Then the next year, things come up and you're more actively doing things. So there's just kind of a different rhythm that you're just always being responsive to and listening with. And so what we have found over time is these things are really valued. And I think, to underline Leslie's point, that the moral support is really important. I think there's so much, sometimes, of people feeling unheard and unseen. When you deal with a lot of rejection on the funding side, that when someone encounters an invitation to a more authentic relationship, it's really valued, and it deepens the work, and it deepened the work for me. I mean, my own work has become tremendously more meaningful because of this particular area of trust-based philanthropy, because that's where the relational part becomes very strong. So that's enough. I would end there.
Thank you, John. Thank you for articulating just the centering of relationships. That's really kind of one of the core values that drives offering support beyond the check. A follow-up question for you, because you and the Whitman Institute provide a range of different types of support beyond the check that sounds like it's super responsive to the needs of nonprofit partners. How do you navigate that? How do you figure out what a need is? Are you hearing directly from grantee partners what they need? Are you kind of intuiting what they need and offering? How do you navigate the different types of support that are needed, and how you can bring in your influence and support as needed? How do you do that?
Yeah, I'd say kind of sometimes feeling my way into that over the years. It is usually wanting to hear from our partners what would be helpful and what they need. And sometimes it's invitational. Like if there's been a transition, or then it's just like, if you want to talk, we're here. Or like post the 2016 election, we kind of, to our strong cohort, said, does everybody just want to get together and try and process what's happening and talk? And so we did that this spring too. So sometimes it's invitational on our part if we're seeing things either internally or externally, where we go, do you want a space to talk and process what's going on? And then it's also responsive.
Another kind of follow-up question that's coming from our audience. We often talk about support beyond the check as totally optional. It's about offering, not giving, right? It's an invitation, as you said. In the context of especially the retreats that you've done in the past, how do you manage that power imbalance? Because there's always this issue with this power imbalance of nonprofits feeling like they have to say yes to whatever the funder is asking, especially if it's a multi-year funder. They want to protect that relationship. How do you make sure that it is truly optional? How do you convey that? And how else do you try to be mindful of those power imbalances that are kind of inherently in the relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And because over the years, it's like, oh, a request is always heard is, no, I have to show up. So I think part of that is on our side is sometimes you have to be willing to sit with their distrust for a while. Do you really mean what you say? Am I really not going to be penalized? And so some of that is just proving through your actions over time that is so. So when we first started doing our retreats, there was a couple people who said, oh, I can't show up. It's not good timing. So it was like, that's okay. And we still kept we didn't discontinue the funding for that. So I think it's really just following through and realizing sometimes you have to prove through your actions and not just your words that you're meaning what you say. And so that becomes more possible if you're having some relationships over time. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's great. We'll hear a little bit more from John in a minute, but I'm going to move us along to Vera de Vera with the Weingart Foundation. And one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that there are many different ways of offering support beyond the check. It looks like it can take a lot of different embodiments. And Vera, I want to turn to you because Weingart takes a more structured approach to offering support beyond the check. And can you share a little bit more with us, Vera, about just what that looks like and why this has become a priority for the Weingart Foundation?
Sure, and I hope you all can hear me. I just want to say up front that Weingart Foundation has been part of the trust-based philanthropy movement for several years. More than 95% of our support is unrestricted operating support, and that we do offer support beyond the grant in ways that both Leslie and John have already talked about in terms of, being open to conversation, to providing support, especially during these times, just having those conversations. But also, I guess what I wanted to do today for the couple minutes that I have is talk about the more formal ways that we also offer beyond the grant support. And I'll very quickly describe 2 ways in which we do that. And this is more around technical assistance, and I'll share why we've taken this approach. The first one, I won't go into too much detail about it, is around capacity building. And just for background and context, Weingart Foundation, of course, with its unrestricted operating support, the grantees can use that money for whatever they need, whatever the capacity building needs are, if they choose to use it for that. We also participate in collaboration with a number of funders through a program that the Annenberg Foundation had offered to grantees that went through their Alchemy program, which was a capacity building program. And our participation in that was a $10,000 grant to one of those organizations for a capacity building program as part of that. So what we did is we took Annenberg's lead, where they are now offering capacity building support to more than 300 organizations in their fold, and then we're offering the same support to about 300 organizations from our grantee list through a collaboration working in partnership with an organization called Catch a Fire. And it's an online platform that matches nonprofits with volunteer pro bono assistance and things ranging from executive coaching to graphic design to fundraising and strategic planning and things like that. And what is good about it at this point in time is that it is a virtual relationship between those pro bono volunteers and the nonprofit. So particularly during this pandemic time, it is a great vehicle for nonprofits to be able to access that technical assistance virtually. And just to share with you about impact, I had just mentioned that we used to provide one $10,000 grant for a capacity building project for one nonprofit organization. Now we're able to, along with Annenberg, reach over 700 nonprofit organizations at a cost of about $650 per nonprofit. And together, over the past 2 years, those 700 nonprofits have been able to get technical assistance valued at more than $3.5 million over the past 2 years, again, from a range of projects. The second example I wanted to share was around technical assistance on the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so last year, when staff was meeting, our staff, of course, have those conversations with our grantees and applicants around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how organizations are incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their governance, management, and practices, right? And so, because of our unrestricted operating support, nonprofits themselves identify what their organizational goals are for the next 2 years or so. And out of the couple hundred active grantees that we had, we last fall identified that at least 60 of those grantees self-identified board diversity as a priority for their organizations. And so we worked in partnership with the African American Board Leadership Institute to provide technical assistance for those organizations who chose to. Again, it was opt-in. We reached out to those 60 grantees who identified board diversity and other equity and inclusion issues as a priority for them. We said, we have the services of the African American Board Leadership Institute available to you if you so choose. This does not affect, your funding. And if you're interested, let us know. About half the organizations responded that they had interest. And in some follow-up from the African American Board Leadership Institute, we managed to identify 10 organizations that were willing to commit the time necessary in this form of support. And so it's no cost to the grantees. Weingart Foundation is paying for their technical assistance. And it's still, what have we learned from this is yet to be seen, because right now, as we're all convening, their first session is being held. And again, this is something that started last fall. It had to be postponed for a couple of months because of the pandemic, and it had to be retooled from in-person gatherings to virtual. But again, this was something that was identified by the nonprofits in their conversations with program officers, and plus the data that we had on their organizational goals. And that's how we identified and tailored this specific support beyond the check to provide additional assistance to those particular grantees. So I will stop there, but wanted to offer up those two concrete examples.
Thank you, Vera. A couple things that I want to just kind of note that we're hearing in Vera's examples and also what John was sharing is this this idea of soliciting feedback, right? It's you're designing these programs and these offerings based on the feedback that you're hearing. So it's kind of a reminder of the integration of all the different trust-based elements, and soliciting feedback is one of them. And I was also hearing, Vera, you in the way you communicated these offerings, there was kind of this articulation of this is not going to affect the funding relationship. So it seems like there was some real intentionality to make sure that it didn't feel required that grantee partners had to take on this type of support. Can you offer some more just insights on how you make sure this is truly opt-in for your nonprofit partners?
Well, definitely in the messaging, like I said, in the communications, both through email outreach when we inform them about this opportunity, and in the conversations that they have with their respective program officers, because those are very open conversations, and program officers are very good about sharing with myself and other colleagues about, what, this organization really believes that they could use some help in XYZ, right? And so this is how we identified these particular two opportunities to help be responsive to those needs that organizations had lifted up in their conversations. But again, it's all in the messaging, and definitely we make it very clear this all opt-in, it's for their benefit if they so choose. Yeah.
I also really love these examples, Vera, because it's an example of how a foundation has these pre-existing relationships, and you can make those relationships and connections available to your nonprofit partners. For folks who are on the line who might be interested in kind of considering or taking on a program like this, what would you recommend? What's your advice on how to get started if you want to set up some kind of formal offering like this?
I guess start with where we have just talked about is how be clear on how you know that this is something that the grantees have interest in doing, right? And again, we have the benefit of not just anecdotal information from the conversations with our program staff, but also from data that we have on the goals that the organizations themselves identified as priorities for themselves. So that system is very helpful to us.
Great. Thank you so much, Vera. Thanks for sharing all that great work. We're going to move on to Carrie Avery, president of the Durfee Foundation. And Carrie, at Durfee, you too, similar to Weingart, you're kind of providing a mix of, support beyond the check, that some of it's kind of informal, some of it's formal, kind of structured and unstructured. Can you share a little bit, Carrie, about Durfee's philosophy on non-monetary support and how this shows up in your work?
Sure. So Durfee's a family foundation, and we are based in Los Angeles and focus on LA County. And one of the ways that we frame what we're doing is that we're supporting the extraordinary people who are making Los Angeles a better place. And full disclosure, Leslie Ito is one of those people. She's a Durfee Stanton Fellow. And we really do look at the people that we support as people, not just as the roles that they inhabit or the heads of the organizations that they support. We look at them as whole people and think about how we can support them as whole people, because it helps them in their leadership roles. And we have a sabbatical program for nonprofit leaders that we've been doing for a long time. People get a grant to be able to take a 3-month break from their job as an executive director and we support the organization during that time. But as part of that program, we bring all of the sabbatical alums together for retreats, for lunches, and gatherings. And to John's point about how even after the grant runs out, it keeps on going. People make jokes about that, we're a family foundation, that once you're in the Durfee family, you're always in the Durfee family, and sort of like Thanksgiving, every year you keep coming back, even if you got your sabbatical years and years ago. And we love that, because part of what we're trying to do is create a network. We're supporting people, but we're also supporting them by creating a network of leadership in Los Angeles across all different types of organizations. We're not a subject matter funder. And we're also supporting organizations at different stages in their development. So we fund newer organizations that are in the first 5 years. Sometimes they're movements, they're not yet 501c3s. We will partner them with a mentor, someone from our sabbatical program or our Stanton Fellowship program, we pay that mentor to work closely with the newer leader to help them as they develop their organization. So that's, there's some check involved, but there's also a lot of relationship building involved in that. Another thing that we do is really look at how we can leverage our position as a foundation. And some of that is in connecting them to other funders. I'm thinking about one of our newer organizations that we support, Lost Angels Children's Project, which is out in Lancaster, California, really, really far north, Los Angeles County. And it's kind of a barrier to get out there because it's really far. And so we put together a site visit. We'd already been we're a grantee of funder of theirs, and we put together a site visit to bring other funders to the space and sort of make it easier for the organization to be able to host a number of funders at one time, and also just to kind of create a fun field trip experience out of driving out to Lancaster, and that resulted in some funding for them. We nominate people for awards from we scout around and look for awards that funders are offering and nominate our grantees for awards. And generally we just want to sort of give the sense that, we're in your corner. Last week was the Social Venture Fast Pitch in Los Angeles, which is a lot of fun. There are 10 organizations that come and do a 3-minute fast pitch about their organization. And one of our grantees, Michael Martinez from LA Compost, did his, and, everybody from the Durfee staff was watching and sending him emails and cheering him on. And that's also the kind of thing that we can do to let people know that we're there for them. Also, all of the other things that John and Vera said about being open and being available, and really, trying to live up to that all the time so that people feel like we are there for them. I'll stop there and let you ask questions.
That's really great. I guess the same question that I asked John, given the range of different types of support that you're offering and connections that you're making. Curious, how many grantees are you in relationship with at any given time? And how do you figure out, or how do you make time or navigate what's needed, and what connections would be most useful? How do you determine that?
So, how many grantees we have is hard to say. We have probably 30 active grantees at one time, but with our alums, it's like the family thing. There always are, they're always in the family. And so people will reach out to us even if they got an actual money grant from us 10 years ago, and we'll still be in conversation with them. And that's closer to 200 people, but they're not all knocking on our door at the same time, and it ebbs and flows, and people have different points at which they're reaching out. It doesn't feel overwhelming, and to John's point, it's about how do you decide. We don't have enormous RFPs where we're reading through hundreds of applications at a time, because we have very targeted grant programs. And so that leaves us more room for relationship.
I also really love, Carrie, the way you talk about these supports beyond the check as kind of like a signaling of we've got your back. Sometimes it's just as simple as that, just kind of acknowledging that and just letting folks know that you're there in case if it's needed. And I think that goes a long way. And also shout out to Claire Peeps, who's the executive director of Durfee Foundation, who's on the line, who works very closely with Carrie on all this great work. Another question for you, Carrie. I'm curious, how have you channeled your kind of, having your grantees' backs in this moment when there's, added strain and stress on many organizations, many families? How have you navigated that, and how has Durfee Foundation been responsive in supporting partners at this time?
Yeah, Leslie's opening about the stress that she's living with is very disheartening and difficult to hear, and that's played out across the country. And every executive director is feeling what she's feeling right now. Because of our network work and hearing from people like Leslie, we started a pilot program of facilitated peer support groups, connecting executive directors with the facilitator. They met over several weeks, every other week, and we just put that out there. If you want to do this, sign up, and a number of people signed up, and we started several of these peer support groups. We just did surveys because they wrapped up, and it was very positive, and we're going to launch even more peer support groups. So that was one of the things that people have found to be helpful. It's just been such a crazy time especially for executive directors to navigate right now, from the very beginning about how do you manage your entire team on Zoom, and how do you help people with that, and then navigating the health scare, the pandemic, the racial reckoning, and then the existential crisis of when is this all going to end. And it just helps, even if there aren't answers right now, it just helps to talk with other people and have somebody else setting up those meetings and doing that part of the work for you. We also, there is a check involved, but it's more than that. We did a staff appreciation grant to 60 organizations that are sort of active in our network. We decided to send $5,000 checks to 60 organizations and to just tell their leaders to use that for staff appreciation however they saw fit. And you didn't have to ask for the money, you didn't have to report back on what you did with the money. We trusted them to do what was needed at this time. And even though we didn't ask for reports back, we got lots of great, photos of desktop fountains and yoga mats and ergonomic keyboards and, groceries and things like that people use for their staffs. And again, that there was a check involved, but it's also in the way that you do it and the way that you say, here's money that you didn't ask for, and we trust you to do what's needed because we know that you and your staffs are under so much stress right now. We gave our cell phone numbers out in the first week of the pandemic, all of our staff, and told people to call if they want to talk with us about anything. And we're just trying to make ourselves available.
I love that. I love that example of just the appreciation gifts. Because it's such an articulation of recognizing the humanity behind this work. Before you're an ED, you're a human being with a family and stress and passions and all these things. And I think something that seems like might seem on the surface a small offering is so meaningful. And the fact that you got all these reports back on how people were using that support it says a lot, right? It says a lot that people were, that it was so meaningful, that gesture. I invite folks on the line to offer questions. I already have reserved a couple questions for our speakers that have come in already. But Leslie, I want to turn it back to you as an executive director. What is resonating for you? What do you want to lift up? What are some of the considerations that you think are particularly useful or poignant for our funder colleagues on the line to hear?
Well, I wanted to do a quick report back to Carrie because I did receive the 5,000 staff appreciation grant, and we're actually in the process. I worked with our staff for ideas, and we decided that part of the funds we would make care packages for our colleagues that were laid off. So we're making individual care packages for them to show our gratitude to them. I've been really struck by the conversations around relationship building and building trust. There's been a lot of conversation here today talking about building trust. And I think that, building trust and how we go about doing that took a very different turn once we entered quarantine. And I've been thinking a lot about my grandma and, if we think about how, no matter how old we are, if we think about how our grandmas used to do things in terms of relationship building and building trust, what did that look like? I feel like that's, we have to return to those days. And so, the care package and for me, sharing lemons from my tree that has been bursting with lemons this season has been my way of connecting with people. It's like my quarantine cup of coffee. Like, I would reach out and make a coffee date with somebody that I wanted to get to know, or somebody that I wanted to pick their brain. But now I feel like my reach out is a written letter or a care package, either delivered by door or by supporting the postal service. But, I think the relationship, we have to think outside the box right now, way outside the box. But there are ways that we can build trust with each other. We just have to be creative.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'm going to start posing some questions that are coming in the chat box, but also I'm getting some just privately. So if you're like, I don't see any questions, it's because some of them are coming directly to me. So I'm going to bring those to our speakers. I also have some questions that I've been kind of sitting with and have discussed with some of our speakers around some of the kind of ethics and power issues related to this work. So please do feel free to share questions directly with me or to the full chat. But Vera, I wanted to come back to you because we did get a question about, and actually this is open to the full panel, but we'll start with you, Vera. Just a question about what are your tips if there's a funder out there that wants to find a technical assistance partner to provide services, support for nonprofit partners. You know, do you have tips on how to identify those prospective partners or intermediaries? You know, what are some best practices or ways to even identify those right kind of technical support partners?
Well, so at Weingart Foundation, we also have relationships with a number of intermediaries. So we do recommend to our grantees, you know, depending on what the ask might be, we will share, you know, with them, these are the intermediaries that we know offer this type of support. And again, they could access the type of support that they need, their particular needs through right now our Catch a Fire partnership. But also if it's, you know, if they want to get additional technical assistance, which they're gonna use their unrestricted operating support for. We do try to provide them with, you know, ideas, and based on the relationships that we have with those intermediaries and other funders as well. But I think what's important in that is that our program staff, there's a culture of sharing those questions that are coming at them with each other, because we may have one program officer who received, you know, a couple of similar requests from their, you know, their grantees. And if they raise it, another program officer might be able to say, hey, you know what, I have grantees that raise the same question. So that's how we can begin to, you know, figure out, okay, is there a bigger need than we're hearing just individually? So I hope that answers that question.
That's great. I think, you know, there's a couple things in that. It's just kind of the active listening that you do. And it also, I really want to lift up what you said about the culture.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when it becomes embedded in the culture of an organization that, you know, like John said, it's like partnering in a spirit of service. It becomes part of the internal discourse, right? Like if someone reads an article that's written by someone that's providing, you know, board support or whatever, that can be shared among staff, and then that can build internal knowledge. So it is part of that culture building and dialogue that happens internally. Obviously that doesn't happen overnight if you don't currently have that type of culture, but it's the intentionality of listening and looking out for opportunities and connecting with each other.
Exactly.
Anyone else want to comment on that, on just kind of strategies for identifying the right kind of technical assistance partners or intermediaries to provide support for nonprofit partners? Okay, I think I think Vera handled that question, and we can move on. So, you know, one thing I want to get a little provocative, because you know, let's talk about race and gender inequity and the reality that perhaps white male leaders might feel more comfortable being direct with funders about what they need. And I'm curious, and I'm going to start with you, Carrie. How can funders correct for this inequity and make sure that this support is being offered equitably, that we're alleviating for implicit bias or kind of inherent inequities and just like people's comfort levels and how they ask for help in these power imbalance relationships? What, you know, how do you think about this, and what advice would you offer?
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where, you know, when we talk about equality versus equity and having to dig deeper to reach equity, that if you can say, yeah, we're open, anybody can contact us if they need help, but not that's equality, but not everyone, you know, we recognize my you know, partner Claire Peeps at the Durfee Foundation, the senior leadership at the Durfee Foundation is two white women of a certain age, and maybe not everybody is as comfortable reaching out to us as others. And I recognize this with a couple of grantees that we have who are fantastic people who reached out to us about sort of extraordinary needs that they had at their organization and wanting to brainstorm with us about how to move forward. And this was a while ago, but we made sort of extraordinary grants to those organizations to help them at a certain time. And it took me a while to recognize, wow, it was, I don't regret those grants at all, but both of those leaders were white men, and they felt comfortable reaching out to us to have those discussions. And we need to make sure that everyone feels as that we are as accessible to them as those white men. And and just I recognize it from a gender point of view that that's men are more comfortable asking for things, and there's a lot of data about men asking for raises and things like that. And so there are race issues and gender issues there, and I just think it's something you need to be conscious of all the time, and thinking about and talking to people about how do we make ourselves accessible, and how do we and maybe you have to do some extra reach out, also creating more diversity on your staff and your board, and otherwise making yourself changing the makeup of who you are is helps in that direction as well.
Thank you. I really love that, just kind of the intentionality, being mindful, and just being aware of that reality and making those observations. I'm going to turn to you, John. I'm curious how you navigate this, or how you've thought about this, just the kind of inequities of, there's certain people who might feel more comfortable asking for something than others. How do you navigate that? How do you think about those kind of race and gender inequities when it comes to support beyond the check?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's both kind of internal ways. How do you model this yourself as an organization? So certainly over time, different things of, having Pia come on as co-executive director, or our own board going from originally a largely older white boomer board to majority people of color and younger board. So I think people look at your organization. I think it's just being invitational and mindful. And I think part of that is also going, oh, I'll invite them, like you show up to me and I'll demonstrate my trust. It's important to show up to to your partner's things. It's important that you read what they've sent, which I have actually found people really, oh, you read it. And you're not just saying, oh, thanks for the report, really interesting. You're going, these are things that particularly struck me and resonated. This has me thinking about this. So you're actually engaging with them on that level. And that is another way to build trust, and especially when there's issues of equity and power. And I think it's also for me personally, and at the Institute, it's demonstrating that you learn and you're acting on what you learn. So just a concrete example of that, the first retreat we ever did, which I mentioned, that was a smaller first time we did it. And when we had all the EDs there, and I looked around the room, and it was like, oh, this is a largely white, older group. They're kind of, oh, peers me. And it's like, it's not like I intentionally set out to do that. We were funding in an area, deliberative democracy at that time, and other things that was tended to be largely white-led. But it was like, no, let's not do this again. And let's be more intentional about who we're supporting and inviting into the room. And that set us, I think me personally and the Institute organizationally on our own journey around that. So by the last retreat we had was just dramatically different. And what I did notice of that when is people of color showing up to that retreat were like, oh, this is a majority people of color space. Oh, you know, and I think even for me was, again, that learning around, you know, my own white male privilege of walking into rooms and assuming, oh, you know, I'm open, I'm trusting everybody, we're all good, you know, and so I think what I have learned is the importance right now, especially I think for, you know, is being able to sit with people's initial maybe distrust and not get defensive and go, okay, that's where we're at, and I'm going to need to prove through my actions to you that I'm meaning what I say. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things in that. Nicole highlighted the learning and acting on learning, how that's such a key part of this. I think also the self-reflection and constant self-reflection and self-examination, not just for you individually, but also for your organization, is such a key part of this work. Leslie, I wanted to just kind of bring you in for a nonprofit leader perspective. How do you, what have been the grounds by which you have felt comfortable asking for support or responding to an offer for support? How have you navigated that as a nonprofit leader?
I guess I'm in a bit of a unique position because I've worked several times in the field leading organizations and also in philanthropy, kind of switching back and forth. So I do have colleague relationships with funders. So, you know, I do think that divide is really, it's a huge delineation. Like, as soon as I'm back on the field side, there's a line that I can't cross. There are tables that I'm not allowed to sit at. But I've never been one to hold back on, reaching out and getting help or picking someone's brain. And it's a two-way street. So, I try my best to also be a resource to folks, and help make those connections and encourage people. And I didn't really realize how, because I've been in a unique position being on both sides of the fence, until I had a development team at the Armory, where, I've been coaching them to be proactive, to reach out, to have conversations. We recently started, last fall, we started a funder breakfast, where we invited all of our funders to come and observe a conversation on cultural equity and inclusion. And that was a way for us to gather, break bread. It was, we invited the funders to come, and I was a little hesitant to do it, but it worked out really well. I was surprised people actually made time in their day to come and spend time with us. And it was a good chance for funders to see each other that hadn't seen each other in a while. So I do think it's, I think it was successful in that, that we were doing the inviting, and the funders actually took the time to meet with us, and hear what the Armory was up to and how we're trying to lead and be very transparent about our cultural equity journey.
Thank you. That's great. Great to hear that. I'm going to bring a question that kind of was related to something we were bringing up before. We often get questions about just how to manage offering this type of support when you've got a lot of grantees. Some folks might have and I thought, Carrie, your example was great because you've got maybe 30 grantees at any given time, but you're also extending supports to kind of alumni and former grantees and this kind of extended family. But maybe, Vera, we can start with you, because I know Weingart, I believe Weingart program officers have a lot of grantees at any given time. And I'm curious, how would you recommend for funders to navigate that? When you've got a lot of grantees, what are some tips of figuring out, offering support effectively in a way that is kind of manageable given the number of relationships?
So I think one way is, the two examples that I shared with you, particularly the board diversity project. Again, that input came from the program officers, and because I help manage our capacity building work for the foundation, they were able to feed that information to me so that it wasn't them having to do like so many individual follow-ups from the inquiries that they were getting from their grantees around, we want to diversify our board. We want to address issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. We just don't know where to turn to, right? And so that, again, from that kind of feedback, that's where we said, okay, we're going to have this partnership and opportunity available to those grantees who articulated that this was an area that they wanted to work on. And so then that project became, again, an opt-in, but took that off kind of the program officer's plate to have to provide intense one-on-one technical assistance, right? So that's one way. I'm not saying that that's always the way that we're able to do it, but yeah, that in all transparency, that's always a challenge, particularly at Weingart, is volume, right? Volume of requests and then volume of grantee portfolios that our program officers have. And many of them have been there for several years. And so they have relationships from 10, 15 years ago, in addition to some newer relationships. But it's always an ongoing challenge. But I think responsiveness is key, right? That the grantees know that they could reach out to our program officers and they will receive a response in a timely manner. So.
Yeah, thank you, Vera. I think that's a great example of, when you do have a large volume of grantees, getting that feedback on where the needs are, identifying where, a majority of those needs are, and finding a right partner that can kind of take on some of that support can go a long way. I know, John and Carrie, you've got kind of smaller grantee pools relative to Weingart Foundation, but you've both also talked about, well, one, it's kind of like, it's not necessarily about always being there with an offering. It's kind of like just a check-in of like, hey, I've got you, let me know if you need a conversation. So it's not, so that doesn't need to be too time consuming. And it also sounds like you kind of navigate based on these multi-year relationships where there might be a greater need for support for a nonprofit. Do either of you want to offer some additional insight on how you kind of navigate offering, a deeper level of support for certain grantees versus, how do you figure that out? How do you manage it time-wise? Any advice for folks on the call who've got a lot of grantee partners?
I think sort of to Vera's point about if you're hearing a lot of the same thing from a lot of people, then you begin to realize, okay, this is sort of, we could maybe kind of bundle this into something that isn't necessarily 25 separate phone conversations, because also there could be some real value in peer support and in bringing people together to recognize that they are they're struggling with similar issues. And so it's really, I don't have a formula for it, but I think it's just something that you're tracking and trying to keep tabs on, and sometimes it's one-on-one, and sometimes it's, you know, things like putting together the peer support groups, or you know, we actually were in the midst of, I don't have anything to report on this, but we have a number of Black leaders in our network, and we met with a couple of senior Black leaders, and Claire and I reached out to them to, you know, during all of the stuff happening in June, and they volunteered to convene a Zoom meeting of the Black leaders in the network to just give Durfee, you know, insight, feedback, whatever. And we have yet to know what that is. That meeting has happened, and we weren't there, and so that's part of it too, is recognizing when you need to maybe let go of some of the control, and let the network, or let people self-organize.
Thank you. And with those peer support groups that you convene, are Durfee staff present for those, or are you also out of the room for those peer support conversations?
No, we're not present. There's a facilitator that we pay to do the groups, but we're not in the room for those.
We did get an inquiry just to hear a little bit more about those facilitated support groups. How often do they happen? Are they opt-in? You know, how do the grantee partners inform the content of those sessions? Can you share a little bit more?
Sure. So, I mean, these are just pilots that we started in I think it was April or May, and we just got surveys back from people. So they were meeting. It was opt-in completely, and 6 people in a group facilitated. They met every other week for, I believe it was 90 minutes, and it was mostly the content would come. It wasn't the facilitator saying, this is what we're going to talk about. The content was arising up from what was on people's minds, and it was changing, you know, with every session, especially during such a dynamic time as the spring and early summer. So those are the basic frameworks, and we, as I said, we sent out surveys and got a sense of, like, what's the best day of the week? What's the best time of day? Do you want it facilitated? We wondered if people just wanted to self-organize and continue on their own, but they said there was a huge value in having a facilitator who was saying, this is the meeting time, this is when it's happening, setting up the Zoom. And I can totally get that, you know, they are so overwhelmed to have to take that on, that level of organization on themselves, is just one thing too many, and then it becomes, you know, a burden and not something that's nurturing to them.
That's another great example of a support that you can provide that doesn't require much time from you and your team. You've hired someone to facilitate that and lead those conversations, and people show up. That's great.
Yeah, and so that's sort of one of those bundling efforts where that's not about us having the one-on-one conversations. And I also think that this is probably much more helpful to them to be meeting with their peers and brainstorming about how to move forward as executive directors than to talk to us at the foundation, because we don't know nearly as much.
Absolutely. And, you know, as a former nonprofit ED myself, it can definitely be, it can feel very lonely. So having those opportunities to connect and commiserate are really valuable. So we're winding down. Before I share our kind of key takeaways and next steps for you all, I would love to invite our panelists to share one insight or thought for the folks who are on the call today. And it can be one theme that you want to lift up from today's discussion, or a piece of advice that you might offer folks who really want to embrace or lean into offering more support beyond the check. And we'll start in the order that we started at the beginning of the call. So I'll start with you, Leslie. What's a thought or a piece of advice you want to leave for our participants today?
I'm going to keep in the theme of quoting my grandma, who's will be 94 next month. She always taught me to ask 3 questions to ask, or 3 questions to follow. Say please, thank you, and how can I help? And I think that's in line with what we've been talking about in terms of being in service to the nonprofit organizations and the grantees.
I love that. Say please, thank you, and how can I help?
Mm-hmm.
I love that. How about you, John? What's one insight or a piece of advice you want to offer folks today?
I guess I'll pick up that theme around time, because it does come up often around this question, and especially how do you have time for this? And so it's going to maybe be different for each organization, but I would say if having the time to create the relationships that will enable you to provide support beyond the check, and if that's important, then design your organization to make that happen. And that can, maybe that will mean fewer and larger grants. Maybe it'll mean looking at staffing differently. But I think it starts with what are the values? And this, I think, gets into the trust-based practices. If these are practices you really want to implement, it may require rethinking some internal structures and internal roles. And then I would also just add, as part of the roles, in a sense of creating an ecosystem of trust, is that I think our ability to provide support beyond the check grows when we do that within a community of our funder colleagues, and that we're mindful of what we're all doing. And I'll just quickly give an example of that. Originally, when we did the trust-based practices, we had holding restorative retreats as its own practice. And then we went, well, wait a minute, if every funder held restorative retreats, what would that mean for all our nonprofit leaders? They'd be forever in retreats. So I think it's also, as we offer the support, ideally we're doing it in our own kind of learning communities so that we can be as responsive and supportive truly as possible. Yeah.
Thank you, John. But it is so important to recognize that ecosystem. I love that story and that example, because it really emphasizes the importance of knowing that there's all these other forces at play too. Vera, how about you? What's one insight or piece of advice you would offer folks today?
I think it's the act of active listening. And it's not just listening when you're in conversation with somebody, or listening when you're sitting around a meeting room or a Zoom room these days, right, to what people are saying, but listening to who you're not hearing from, right, and finding ways to kind of unearth what some of those needs might be if they're not verbally articulating them. Like for us, going back to our data, right, on written goals that organizations set for themselves, we were able to confirm what we were kind of hearing and test that, right, because this is what the organizations had written as part of their goals. I'm also listening. I guess I'll share an example too of even reading grant applications. There was a set of grant applications around youth organizing that we were reviewing, and a couple of applicants mentioned wanting to increase organizing capacity in a certain part of LA, that there wasn't that infrastructure present, right? And being able to connect the dots from pieces of information, we were able to say, hey, a number of folks identified this one organization who's not a Weingart grantee currently, but is an important partner to many of our current grantees. And so we actually reached out to that organization, invited them to apply, because our partners were talking about them and saying what a crucial, so listening not just by our ears, but by what we're reading, what we're, observing, and being able to connect those dots in support of the nonprofits, I think is what I'll offer.
Thank you, Vera.
Mhm.
That's such a great, great demonstration of active listening and why it's so important. It's also kind of bringing up for me just how interconnected all the principles are, because, you know, we're talking about offering support beyond the check, that's our focus, but then there's soliciting and acting on feedback, there's being transparent and responsive, all these other elements that really are kind of intertwined in order to really make this type of support that much more meaningful. Carrie, your kind of final insights or words of wisdom for our partner or for our colleagues today.
Yeah, well, reflecting on the interconnectedness of trust-based philanthropy, the idea for these peer support groups, we always joke at Durfee, like we've never had an original idea in our lives, that all of our ideas come from our grantees, and the peer support groups, that's one of those ideas. It came to us from a Sabbatical alum who actually became a facilitator. She's retired from her job at this point, and she became a facilitator for these pilot groups. And it was a fantastic idea. And she came to us and we listened and went with it. So I would also just add that the support beyond the check this is where you get, I feel like if you don't do this, this is where the greatest joy of this work is found. And so to deprive yourself of this is to deprive yourself of these deep connections and ability to work closely and maintain and create and maintain relationships with people. And really, as you hear from Leslie, who's in her role as an executive director, that can be what keeps people going. Is not sure the checks are great, but it's these extra layers of support that you might not even know you need that are really the most meaningful. So I would encourage people to think about this and pursue it.
I love that. And so I'm going to do we're almost done, but I would love to do a few key takeaways for all of us. So just to sum up some of the things that we've heard, non-monetary support can be sometimes can be more meaningful than financial support, especially in times of challenge. That's not to say financial support is still very important. So keep prioritizing multi-year unrestricted support if you can. Always remember, support beyond the check should be offered as optional, and be clear about that in the way you communicate it. Modeling humility and vulnerability can help shy grantee partners feel more comfortable. And actually, I wrote this before today's session, but I really want to emphasize modeling humility and vulnerability is part of this process. It's how you show up. It's how you build trust. It's how you can build relationship. It's a key part of this work, and is a key aspect of offering support beyond the check, which is related to the final point here. This is an opportunity to foster deeper relationships. As Carrie said, more joy in the work, which is really meaningful and really important, especially right now when we need reasons to be joyful, and especially so when it's a multi-year commitment that really allows that opportunity to build relationship over time. So what can you do right now? One thing you can do is to do an internal brainstorm with your team about ways that you might offer support beyond the check if you're not already doing it, or ways to be more intentional in building it into the culture, as we heard from Vera and John. So if you are already offering support beyond the check, maybe take another look at the process and the language, and just make sure that the offering is genuinely totally optional. And maybe you want to make some adjustments to the language and making sure that folks know that it's optional. For now, as you heard, the stresses that are facing a lot of nonprofit leaders, if you haven't reached out individually just to check in on a grantee partner since the pandemic started, might be a good time to just drop them a personal note and offer a listening ear, especially at a time when kids are going back to school. So people who are parents are dealing with a lot of extra stresses. Maybe just like a, hey, just thinking about you note can go a long way. Always want to plug the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. We've got a resource page with lots of tools that are available, including recordings of these sessions. You'll be receiving a link to our survey. We would love to know how you thought today's session went so we can improve for next time. And then finally, we've got our next final webinar of this series, Making the Case for Trust-Based Philanthropy, where we'll answer questions around how to get staff on board, how to talk to your board about this stuff, how to work through some of those sticking points of trying to embrace these practices. And we'll cover it all in 90 minutes, but well, I'm just joking. We'll cover as much as we can in 90 minutes, but that is an opportunity for you to bring your questions to us as you are embracing and adopting a lot of these practices. So we hope that can be a useful resource to you. Finally, I want to thank our partners at Philanthropy California. Special thanks to Kate Seeley and the team at Northern California Grantmakers for managing registration and technical backend and all the stuff that helped us run super smoothly today. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Marissa and Daniel and all the team over there. And also special thanks to Southern California Grantmakers and San Diego Grantmakers for being excellent partners and promoters and thought partners in this process. And that is it. Our time is up. We hope to see you all on September 15th for our next session. Thanks again and have a good rest of your week.
Bye.